Hi, hello everyone. My name is Hadil, and today we're going to talk about how to light a scene in Blender. I rotate between 4 different lighting setups. One is a sky texture with a sun position, and then another one is the sun with an HDRI. A third one is area lights with HDRI, and the fourth one is a spotlight or a plane with emission with a mask. Let's talk about my least used ones first, and then transition into the one that I use in most of my projects. The one I rarely use is the spotlight with a mask or with a texture, or the plane with the emission. They're the same thing. The only difference is that one I use an actual light for it, and that is a spotlight. If you go down here to the light, spotlight, and you can add a texture to this. If I go to the light settings and I check use nodes, I can go to shading, or I can just get it right here. Go to shader editor. It is part of the object, and then add an image to the color for the emission. Because right now it's only white, and if I add a black and white mask, then it's going to emit light only from the white areas, and that will create a texture on the light. I think they're called gobos in photography, and they're usually films that goes onto your light, so it adds effects to your photography. But I don't think I've ever used the spotlight. I just know that you can use the spotlight, but I've only used a plane with an emission and again an image texture for this, and then position it where I need the texture to be. This is just an easier way to add a little bit of realism to your lighting. If you have blinds on your window, then that's what's going to hide parts of the light, creating a shadow that looks like the blinds. Or if you have a tree near your window, then it's going to affect the light that goes into your window. And that's the thing that you can create with these. I haven't perfected this yet, but I've used it in this project specifically. And I think that's the only time I've used it since I've started the set of projects on my feed on Instagram. I like to add actual objects in my scene to affect the lighting instead of having just gobos, but you can definitely add an animated gobo if you want, and that will affect also the lighting in an animation. So it'll look like trees are moving, and it's just a black and white mask that you can animate anywhere. Or you can maybe take a photo or a video of a scene and then turn it into a black and white image and use it as a mask for your lighting. In this project for the buzzword challenge, I did use a honeycomb look, or something resembling the hexagon holes in a honeycomb, and that is just distorted and reflected on the background. It doesn't really look like there is anything, but it added texture to the background. The second one that I rarely use, but a little bit more than the textured lighting, is the sky texture with sun position. If you add a sun, let's actually remove the spotlight. And now instead of positioning the sun myself, I do position the sun myself sometimes, only if I'm using it with the HDRI, and I'm going to talk about that next. But if I'm going to use the sun for the sky texture, an important thing I do is go to the world properties and change the color over here into a sky texture rather than what it is right now, which is an environment texture. And if you want to know, or if you want to see the nodes for this, you can definitely go to the, again, shader editor, same as the lighting and the objects, but go to world. And now you can actually see what is happening. So this is an environment texture, which is an HDRI image or an EXR image. And I attach it to the color over here. But I don't really use the nodes that often unless I'm combining 2 different HDRI, which is something that I rarely do, so we're not going to talk about it in this video unless I've used it in a project and I want to show you how I used it. But I do most of my editing for the world over here, not in the node section. So I go over here, go to sky texture, and now I go to the sun position setting. But this is not on by default. So I have to go to edit, preferences, and then add-ons, and then sun position. So for lighting, you're gonna have to turn on the sun position, and it's going to be over here. And then sun object is the sun lighting that we added, and immediately it's going to change its position And now if I add any object, I change the position of the camera to the top, change the X and Y to 0, and then bring it in with Z. And if you hit 0 on the numpad key, if you don't have that, as usual, you go to Edit, Preferences, Input, Emulate Numpad, and now your regular numbers on the keyboard are going to work as if you have a numpad. So 0 is going to go out of camera mode and then go into camera view. Now I can have the shading. You can see the sun is extremely strong. So if I go to the world again, or to the world properties, and now I can play around with how the lighting is going to look. I don't have specific settings for these. Sometimes it works perfectly for me and sometimes it doesn't really look nice, and so I change my lighting setup altogether. But you can change the latitude and longitude depending on how you want your lighting. And of course over here for the sky texture itself, you can change the sun intensity, hit shift to hold how intense it is, and then you can add a little bit of air, which is going to make the scene a bit yellower. And then you can add dust, so how it will look if you have more dust. And then I don't really touch the ozone. I don't really touch any of these unless I wanted to add some warmth, and then I add a little bit of air. And then the strength is just the strength of the entire lighting for whether it's an HDRI or a sky texture. And now going back to here, we can change the time to reduce the harsh lighting because now we're in the afternoon, and this will make it a little bit lower. And here you can see that the sunrise is at 8:08, and then at 3:30 it's going to sunset. And this is based on the latitude and longitude. So if you change it based on maybe where you live, you can also use day of the year and distance as well. What I do is just change the latitude and longitude so it fits something closer to how it is where I live. Right now, for us, I think the sunrise is at about 6:30 or something, and then the sunset is at about 5:30, and that is a little bit more realistic to me, and I can understand what I'm doing with the time. And then I offset the north to change where the light and shadows are. If I go to object, we have this shader. Right now it's emission, that's why we don't have a shadow. Principal BSDF is the main texture. Let's change its color, change the color of this one as well. Bring back the sun intensity to 1, then change how the north offset is. We don't even have to show the camera, we can just see the entire thing. Yeah, and that's basically what you can do with sky textures and the sun position add-on. As you can see, this is very harsh lighting, so I don't necessarily use it in my projects just because it's not fitting to my entire feed. And you can actually see it in this project, and it looks a little bit harsher than my other projects, which is a lighting that I don't necessarily enjoy. I like studio lights more, and that's my next lighting setup. I like to use HDRI with sun, and to me that looks more like a sun than this, because technically if you want to add a sky texture, it's not going to be this clean unless you're in a desert. And even then, there's still going to be shadows in certain areas and a little bit of light in other areas. And it doesn't really look nice when you don't have much in your scene anyway. So imagine not having anything in the background and not having anything in your scene. It's going to be a little bit boring. So what I like to do is use a sun, but with an HDRI. So if I create another world, a new world, and then I go to environment texture, remove the sun and all of this, and open an image or choose an image. I already have an HDRI, and I'll link down below to a website where you can get free HDRIs. I like HDRI Haven, and it's where I get most of my HDRIs. And this is one of my favorite ones, the Studio Small 09 at 4K. Initially, this gives very interesting shadows. So it's not just giving me one strong shadow over here, it's also giving me shadows based on the different lights on this in the scene. And if you want to actually see this scene, you can go to, it's by default shown, but if you go to the render settings, and you go to film and toggle the transparent, you're gonna actually see the studio lights or the studio in general. And this is how it looks. So HDRIs are 3D environments. It's a 3D image and it looks like a sphere that you opened from the inside. So it's as if it's a texture of a sphere from the inside. And you can definitely increase the size of these based on the texture, but I don't mind. And you can actually see how it looks. And if I grab a bunch of other ones, if I take this cinema lobby, for instance, it's gonna give me a tint. It's gonna give me a different hue or a different tint on the image. So there's a blue over here, a little bit, a teal, something like that. And then you can take this gym, for instance, because it has a lot of ceiling lights. It's going to create nice reflections if you have a roughness like this. So depending on what reflections you like, but for me, the majority of the time I'm using this studio light. And you can actually see the two studio lights, and then there are a bunch of other lights over here. Or actually, I think one of them is the sun, yeah. And this is a reflection probably of the two area lights, or maybe lights on the ceiling. I haven't really looked at the HDRI, but I just like the reflections of a studio light because they're not that many, and so I can add on top of them if I wanted to. And so I add a sun over here, and now I can just control the sun from the lighting settings over here, from the object data properties, and you can change the color of it. So I sometimes make it a little bit yellow. I've used this lighting setup in these 3 TBR projects because it was the summer trackers and summer TBR post, and I wanted to make a pool, but the lighting setup is the same for all of them. And because I have a lot of objects and a lot of plants, the lighting looks really nice because it has a lot of different objects to cast different shapes of shadows, and that creates a little bit of realism in your project, even if your project itself isn't necessarily something that you might see in real life. It's those little things that make your project look a little bit more elevated. Look at a scene that you like around you and see what it is that you like about it. Maybe look at your room, what it is that you like about your room, or if you have a sunroom, then look at how the shadows are reflected inside of that room. Is it a bunch of plants on your window, or is it a tree outside your window, or maybe the blinds of your window? All of these things will affect how your lighting is going to be reflected inside of your room. And with these projects, I do that often. I always think about how I want those reflections and shadows to look and what makes it a little bit more interesting. And I know everybody says less is more with lighting. It is technically less is more, and it's also better for your renders in the end because the more area lights you have, the more render time. And so combining HDRIs with a sun or with an area light is going to reduce the render time, and it's going to make your lighting a lot nicer. And I'm always rendering with cycles. If I've never said that, then I'm saying it in this because it's very important. If you do Eevee or if you use Eevee, HDRIs are not going to look that nice unless you bake the lighting. But we're not going to talk about that because I never really use Eevee anymore. So yeah, with this lighting setup, I only use it if I want a harsh sunlight with my HDRI. But because I want to see the light alone without the HDRI, what I do is reduce this to 0 at first, see how my sun is looking. So I can actually adjust the colors a little bit more, maybe make it less yellow, reduce it a little bit, maybe make it 1.5, change the angle of it, and then go back over here and I add a little bit, not the entire studio light, because I want it to look a little bit more like the sun, but I also want a little bit more shadows without adding too much inside lighting, especially if I want to use the sun. Maybe increase it a little bit more. Also with sun, you can definitely change the HDRI to be something that is outside and not inside. So you can do outdoor or HDR outdoor, but it's going to be a little bit more harsh, just so you know. and maybe use something with a little bit more trees so you can have different shadows and reflections. And you can also rotate the world. So if I go like this and then I hit Control T. If you cannot do this, it's because you don't have the Node Wrangler add-on. So if you have this turned on, there are some shortcuts for your textures. I never talked about this because we haven't yet talked about textures. And now if you hit Control T, you get a mapping and a texture coordinates. And now you can rotate the texture on the z-axis, and that will adjust the lighting for you. So if I go 0, it'll adjust the sun position. But then your actual sun is going to be in a different place. Just be aware of that if you're trying to use a sun with a texture, like an outdoor texture like this. But yeah, I only use Studio Small. Now the last lighting setup, and the one I use the most, is the area light with HDRI. I don't use a sun the majority of the time. I use an area light. So I already have these reflections that are created by the small studio. If I go up to 1, I get the actual lighting. Sometimes I only use the HDRI alone, but the majority of the time I'm actually adding area lights. For this project, for instance, I got asked about this project's lighting. It's this HDRI with a very low strength, so about 0.3, 0.2 probably. And then I added an area light to the side. I'm in front view right now. And then I grab the area light, put it over here. And to see what is happening, I always turn off the strength on the world, go to my camera and adjust the lighting. And I go to the lighting settings. I always have it at 300 or above. And then let's make it bigger. The bigger it is, the more diffuse the lighting, of course. And the smaller it is, the more harsh the lighting is. So if I go really small, then the lighting is harsher. But if I make it a lot bigger, then it's going to be softer. Let's also add another one over here just to replicate what I created with this project. And I made it a little lower. And now this other light is going to be a different color. So maybe make it a little bit on the redder side, warmer than the other one. Now if I go to the camera and if I go to the world, I can add a little bit of this. So this tint over here is not overpowering, but it adds a little bit of gradient for this color. And this is my most used setup for lighting. The HDRI is for the main lights and shadows, or for general lighting, and then the area lights for specifics and direct lighting, and also for colored effects. You can definitely change the area light settings or the shapes to a rectangle, so you can create something a little bit different with the way the lights reflect on your objects. And also you can change the spread. So let's say something at 90 degrees or 20. So this is the angle of spread. 180 is going from this edge to this edge. But if it's 90 degrees, then it's going to go at 90 degrees. I keep it at 180 at all times. And then you can also make it a disc. You can make it an ellipse, depending on what kinds of shadows you want. I sometimes create a bunch of rectangles to mimic something like the gym HDRI, for instance. And then, yeah, for this one, you can go lower or higher. And then for these, you can go also lower or higher. So you can go 300 for this, maybe 500 for this. And depending on how far it is from the object, it's going to be harsher or softer. For my thumbnails, I use a Studio HDRI, this Studio HDRI at full strength, and I don't really use anything else. Because usually there is a lot of things happening in my thumbnails that I don't want the lighting to be overpowering or to be the main focus in any kind of way. And I also haven't been talking about my thumbnails for the past 2 tutorials, just because joining and separating objects doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the thumbnail. So the thumbnail is just mimicking the idea of joining and separating objects. The same goes for keyframed shape animations. It's an animation, so I cannot really show it in the thumbnail. I can just mimic the ideas of the animations and the shapes that I usually create with that technique or those tools that I'm trying to explain in the videos. And then for the lighting, I'm just going to add a bunch of lights or objects that are considered lights. So light bulbs or a desk lamp. So we're not going to talk about the thumbnail in this video as well. That's in case you were wondering. So yeah, that's it for lighting. I hope the examples for my projects helped you out. These tutorials are meant to show you my workflow and how I use the different lighting setups for my projects, depending on what I need for that specific project. Also with lighting, it's just your preference and it's trial and error the majority of the time until you have something that you really like and you keep repeating that. And that's usually what happens with me. If I don't want to think about lighting, I just copy a setup that I've created before and then I can focus on the project itself. That's it for today and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.